All right, the next topic in Romans is Romans 8, which is the Spirit, the Holy Spirit. It is step 4, and we have led up to the idea that the second sin problem is that we periodically sin because we're operating in the flesh. And so, what is the answer to that? If you look in verse 4, chapter 8, verse 4, it says that the righteous requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. So walking in the Spirit allows you, enables you to live righteously. Okay? Now this is documented in Yeshua's Path, Volume 1. And so the first section of this book is going to deal with the 7 steps of Romans. And step number 4 is what we're working on. It will refer you to Appendix 2 at the end of that step if you have any objections to the Holy Spirit. There is a lot of false teaching out there about the Holy Spirit, and so that appendix deals with those kinds of issues. If you have any questions or objections to the Holy Spirit, Appendix 2 is where you need to look at. So we have led up to the idea that the second sin problem is that we periodically sin, and it has to do with the flesh causing that, and walking in the Spirit is the key to avoiding sin, to changing us so that we stop sinning. Now, the issue that is not being brought up here is the issue of consistency. So at the beginning of the path, you're going to be stepping out of the Spirit periodically. And as a result, you're going to continue to sin periodically. Now, the other 3 steps that we still have in Romans is going to address the resources that we have to change us so that we're consistently walking in the Spirit. And when we walk consistently in the Spirit, then we will actually have victory over the sin nature and stop sinning completely. And prior to that, though, you're going to be in and out during the process of learning this stuff. Now, every level, there are 7 steps in the book of Romans. Romans is the first level. There are 7 levels up to apostle, and that takes us up through 2 Thessalonians. And in each of those levels, there is a spiritual test. Okay, we don't get a certificate from man. We don't go through a man's test to see if we're going to be a graduate of a human school, but rather we let God do the testing on us. And the first test that we have to pass is receiving the Holy Spirit. Okay, and this is in verses 9 through 10. But you are not in the flesh, but in the Spirit, if indeed the Spirit of God dwells in you. Now, if anyone does not have the Spirit of Messiah, he is not his. And if Messiah is in you, the body is dead because of sin, but the Spirit is life because of righteousness. So, being in the Spirit and being in Messiah is tantamount to the same thing. And that is what is going to cause us to live righteously and pass the judgment. We're not going to live righteously and we're not going to pass the judgment if we do not have the Spirit. But you'll notice that it uses this word if here. If means that there's some way that we can know that we have the Spirit. Right? See, if indeed the Spirit of God dwells in you. Okay? So we know that we pass the test if we have the Spirit. If we don't have the Spirit, then we are not passing the test. So there has to be some way for us to recognize if we have the Spirit or not. And it can't be that we're living righteously, because living righteously is down at the end of the process. Okay? We need to know up front if we're on the right track. And how do we know that? We know that by if we have the Holy Spirit. So, that's the question. How do you know if you have the Holy Spirit? It has to be something tangible. It has to be something that we can actually see. Okay? And this is actually mentioned, if you jump down to verse 18, we're going to read 18 through 23. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. For the earnest expectation of the creation eagerly waits for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope. Because the creation itself also will be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and labors with birth pangs together until now. Not only that, but we also, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, eagerly waiting for the adoption, the redemption of our body. So the first fruits of the Spirit is this groaning that is being mentioned here. Okay? Now, if you jump down to verse 26, it describes this groaning a little bit more. Likewise, the Spirit also helps in our weaknesses, for we do not know what we should pray for as we ought, but the Spirit himself makes intercession for us with groanings which cannot be uttered. Now, the word uttered means to be understood, okay? So we are saying something that is not understandable, okay? And it's called groanings. Groanings is the first piece of the gift of tongues. And this is specified over in Acts 10. Let's jump over to Acts 10. And down at the end of the chapter, Peter is talking to a group of Gentiles. And down at verse 44, it says, and we're in Acts 10:44, while Peter was still speaking these words, the Holy Spirit fell upon all those who heard the word. So, we're talking about receiving the Holy Spirit, right? How does he know that they received the Holy Spirit? Verse 45, and those of the circumcision who believed were astonished, as many as came with Peter, because the gift of the Holy Spirit had been poured out on the Gentiles also. So these other guys, they knew that the Holy Spirit fell on these guys. How did they know it? For, verse 46, for they heard them speak with tongues and magnify God. Then Peter answered, can anyone forbid water that these should be baptized who have received the Holy Spirit just as we have? And we commanded them to be baptized in the name of the Lord. Then they asked him to stay a few days. So baptism is the recognition that these people are actually in the family of God. And we know that because they passed the spiritual test of Romans, which is receiving the Holy Spirit. And we know that they received the Holy Spirit because they received the gift of tongues. Okay? So in Romans 8, it talks about this groaning, which is the beginning of the gift of tongues. When you receive tongues, a lot of times you don't get a full language at the beginning. You'll get a groaning, or you may get a single syllable. Okay? You need to continue to seek the Holy Spirit in order to get a full-blown language. But to answer the question, how do we know that we have the Holy Spirit? It has to be something tangible. And the supernatural gifts of the Holy Spirit are very tangible. We know this stuff. And tongues in particular is very tangible. You can't fake tongues unless you and not know it. You know, if you can fake tongues, but you're trying to fake tongues. Okay, so if you're trying to fake tongues, then you know that you're faking it, right? But if you are receiving this stuff and it's coming out, then it's not, you're not faking it, right? If you get thoughts, which are prophecy, well, where are those thoughts coming from? You don't know. They might be from your own ideas, right? So that's kind of difficult to know, okay? But there's other gifts, miracles and healings and things like that. So there's a lot of different gifts, but tongues is the one that you see in the book of Acts. In this age, most people, the first gift they get is tongues. And tongues is very tangible, and it's very difficult to accidentally fake. Okay, so it's something that is recognizable, and there is also a connection that is made. If someone has the Spirit and someone else receives tongues, there is a spiritual connection that is made that they're recognizing. And that's what's happening there in Acts 10. He said, does anyone have a problem with giving them baptism? Well, what he's asking for is a judgment. He's asking for people to say, did you connect spiritually with those tongues? And the answer by silence was the fact that they were definitely connecting with them on a spiritual basis. So this is this is the test of Romans. So here's your question. Do you have to have the Holy Spirit to be saved? It's a big question in Pentecostal circles. How do we know that? Well, Romans is talking about receiving the Holy Spirit. It's actually saying here that if you don't have the Holy Spirit, you don't have Messiah. Okay? If your faith is an academic faith that has not reached out to become effective faith yet, okay? If you haven't received the Holy Spirit. So receiving the Holy Spirit is part of it. And we also know that the Romans is the gospel. So, and this Holy Spirit is mentioned here in Romans, and therefore it's part of salvation. Okay? So that answers the question right there. But we know that we have effective faith, and we are actually connected to God when we operate in the supernatural gifts of the Spirit. So if you're not operating in it yet, you need to receive that. And in the next video, we'll talk about how to receive the Holy Spirit. But in this video, we're seeing why it's important and the fact that it is the key to overcoming the sinful nature. Okay? So the Holy Spirit, Romans 8.